What's up guys, this is SkyTech Freak, and if you guys saw my last video, I was basically talking about some physical upgrades that you can make to your laptop to make sure it has more RAM, more storage, and that it ran a bit cooler in terms of thermals and stuff like that. And the physical upgrade you can make to help thermals is basically pretty limited to just repasting the heatsink on the CPU and GPU. So reapplying the thermal paste, maybe adding some thermal pads, and then reinstalling the heatsink on top of that so the thermal connectivity gets better. But there are a few software tricks as well that you can put onto your laptop to make sure that it runs cooler than it is. So if you've got a gaming laptop or an older laptop that's basically running really hot, and what happens is when it runs hot it also loses more battery, because what's happening when the laptop is actually getting hot is that the CPU and GPU are pulling a lot more power, and that power is of course coming from the battery. So I have just a few tricks here to help reduce the heat that's coming from the laptop and to slightly increase your battery life. So the first software tweak that you want to make is go ahead and download Intel Extreme Tuning Utility. So it's XTU, or Intel Extreme Tuning Utility. This is basically an overclocking or undervolting utility that basically lets any Intel computer mess around with the limits like power limits and clock speed, etc. of the processors, especially for laptops. You can of course do this on desktops as well, but on desktops there are far more tools within the BIOS, etc. as well. Here of course you can go into this, and once you open up Intel Extreme Tuning Utility, you'll get a lot of information and a lot of confusing numbers. You don't actually have to worry about too many of them. You don't have to give much of this any thought. Just come down to all controls, and you can of course overclock as well. As I was telling you, you can overclock the CPU, you can give it more voltage as well, but that'll of course make the computer hotter. So if your laptop is running exceptionally cool and you want to see how far you can push it, then you can go ahead and increase the amount of voltage you want to give your laptop. But what we're trying to do is decrease the amount of voltage because our laptop is getting too hot. And so in that case, what you want to do is go ahead down to core voltage offset and just start reducing it. Now I would say you want to start at like minus 0.050. So down here you want to start at 0.050 V, and you just click on that, and then you want to run stress test, and just run that stress test for 5 minutes. And if it comes back stable, that doesn't necessarily mean that your laptop is stable at that voltage. It's possible that it runs the stress test a few times and all your other tasks are going really well as well, and then one day suddenly it just blue screens out of the blue and you have no idea what it is. So you should know that it's probably the core voltage offset. So what you want to do is go ahead and try each of these. You can even try other stress tests. So I would say try Cinebench and maybe try TimeSpy, just to make sure that whatever core voltage offset you set is actually stable. And the way I'd go ahead in increments is you want to start at 0.050 and then probably move 20 more. So you want to go from 0.050 to maybe 0.070 or 0.080, and then keep increasing it by 20. So you can go to 0.100. You can go to 0.120, and I know 0.120, 0.125 is where most laptops are basically at their limit of how much you can undervolt them. Any more than that and it becomes a silicon lottery thing, as in some CPUs can handle it, some CPUs can't. Mine actually goes down to minus 0.165 volts before blue screening or running into any everyday issues. I'm running an Intel i7 8th generation. This is the Aero 15X V8. So my specific laptop can actually be underclocked significantly to this bit, but I've heard for this exact laptop you can go down to minus 0.185, and even people have managed to go 0.200 in terms of undervolting. So of course it depends a lot on your laptop. You just want to make sure that it is stable, and like I said, just the stress test isn't usually enough. I mean, it's a good indicator, so you know immediately nothing's going to go wrong. But even a day or two later, you could still have a blue screen, and you'll know that you have to attribute it to the undervolt. But yeah, once you undervolt it, of course, you run the stress test. You'll see that because when you run the stress test, it'll say that that the CPU is being limit throttled or EDP current throttled, and that means that the CPU is not getting to go as fast or boost as far as it could, only because you're not giving it enough current. And that's actually a good thing, because then when the CPU boosts, it pulls a lot more power, it drains the battery faster, and it heats up the laptop. So if you're not doing any crazy CPU intensive tasks, and especially if you've got a gaming laptop, you should know that the gaming aspect of it isn't very dependent on your CPU. It's more dependent on the GPU, and so you can safely undervolt your CPU without losing out on any significant performance, right? So that's just one thing you can look at in Intel Extreme Tuning Utility. If you don't have a gaming laptop, you can even go ahead and reduce the graphics voltage offset of your integrated graphics. So like your Intel UHD 650 or 750, depending on what uh, processor you have in your laptop, you can reduce that as well. But since I have a 1070 Max Q in this, the integrated graphics aren't really doing much except for everyday tasks. So they don't really get that hot, and so I haven't felt the need to undervolt the graphics at all. And then this is what the stress test screen looks like, and you can go ahead and increase or decrease how much time you want that stress test to last. I leave it at 5 minutes just because I change it around so much, so I want to get into the next tweak as soon as possible. And as you can see here, it says the CPU is current throttled when I ran my last stress test, and that's because, like I said, we're not giving it enough voltage or as much voltage as it would like, so that it can't get as hot. Right now, if you have a dedicated graphics card, you can also go into Afterburner. So this is an application called MSI Afterburner, and you can sort of play around with the clock speed and memory clock speed. Now, unlike the CPU, which you want to undervolt, if you want better gaming performance, you want to overclock the core clock speed and the memory clock for better gaming performance. But again, do this at your own discretion, and this doesn't really help your thermal performance either. It's only going to make it worse because you're pushing the graphics card more than it is spec'd to actually be able to push. And so for that reason, it's not really a thermal fix, it's more like a gaming performance boost, and that is of course only if you are able to get your GPU stable at those clocks and are able to not blue screen and still keep the laptop relatively cool. Now the second big thermal and battery performance upgrade that I wanted to talk about, or tweak that I wanted to talk about, is in control panel. So you just want to go to start, you want to hit control panel, come into control panel, and you want to type in power, and you go into power options and figure out whatever sort of power plan you're on, and you want to go to change plan settings. Let this be whatever it is, but what we want to do is go into advanced power settings and scroll down to processor power management. Now the minimum processor power state on battery and plugged in will both be 5%, and we don't want to touch that because, I mean, if the CPU and computer can run effectively at 5%, who are we to say any different? What you want to do is in maximum processor state on battery, and this is now a really good way to save battery life and stop the computer from getting too hot, is you want to make sure you reduce the processor on battery pretty significantly. So I've had this as much as 35% to 65%, and now it's on 85% because I usually have a charger around me. But in places where I can't frequently charge, just to save battery, I've had this be as low as 65 to 35 or 50%, and that's fine because this is an i7, so even 50% of the performance is still very decent for everyday tasks such as web browsing and stuff like that. And I have a decent amount of RAM in this laptop, so there's always space for stuff to stay open, and it's mostly just the processor or the processor speed. And when it's not pushing the processor hard, we aren't draining battery that fast, and we aren't getting that hot as well. Now, that's just on battery, right? You guys are probably wondering, well, on battery, that makes sense that you'd want to reduce it because you want to save battery life and you don't want to push the laptop too hard and get it too hot. But why plugged in do you not have it at 100%? Why do you only have it at 95%? And this is interesting because if you want good gaming performance without the laptop getting too hot and without a lot of fan noise, etc., what happens is when you limit it at 95 or even 99%, it'll basically reach very close to the stated clock speeds that it's meant to run at in the laptop, but it won't be able to boost higher. And what you do by limiting the ability to boost higher or restricting it from boosting higher is letting the processor run at a speed that's above this like rated speed that it's supposed to generally run at. And when it does boost is when the laptop actually gets very, very hot. So I suggest, especially if you're gaming and not doing CPU intensive tasks, to go ahead and leave that at 95 or 99% rather than have it at 100, which lets it boost past 100 and then push itself to an extent where your laptop's getting very hot and your battery is draining very, very fast. So these are just some of the few tweaks that I thought would be helpful to talk about. And if you guys implemented them and found them to be pretty helpful, please leave a like and subscribe. Let me know any comments in case I got something wrong, or if you guys have other tweaks for anyone else as to how to reduce the thermal heat coming out of the laptop or to increase battery life for your laptops as well. But that's all for now, guys. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.